The next two sections are dedicated to studying the excerpts of certain parts and headings from 19 CFR Chapter 1. This is not an exhaustive list of parts and headings, just the most important ones that are very consistent with what we've been talking about thus far. In this section here, we're going to go over the prose-based aspect. In section 23, which will be the next section, we'll provide a more visual portrayal of what we're talking about and the actual online tools that are out there. As noted, the Code of Federal Regulations is set up by titles, chapters, and parts. It is our job to understand how that structure works and what topics are found where, by title, by chapter, and part. The reason why we need to have that structural understanding is best said in bullet 2. Each part within 19 CFR Chapter 1 addresses a specific topic. The following slides, as we just stated, cover the most relevant parts from 19 CFR Chapter 1. As a note, these most commonly used parts will be excerpted in this section as well as during upcoming topic-specific analysis. That's just another way of saying we're going to see this material repeatedly in both its online format and its definition-specific format, but also brought back to life with real-world examples. Stay tuned for that. Some of the key excerpts. Part 141, the entry of merchandise. We saw that in one of our previous visually oriented slides. The entry process. We also saw that. That's in part 142. A subject we've talked about fairly frequently, starting with its very definition and then going into examples. Part 144, warehouse and re-warehouse entries and withdrawals. That's subject of bonded warehouses, warehouse entries, as we defined so many sections ago. We've also talked about foreign trade zones a lot. We see that in part 146. Trade tip, we saw this already. We'll point it out again. Within each part is a table of contents that goes into even greater detail. For example, part 141 on entry of merchandise is covered through 141.0 through 141.113. We showed that in our first visual. We'll see it again. Continuing on, part 151, the examination, sampling, and testing of merchandise by CBP or other partner government agencies. Second bullet, part 152, is a subject we've seen a lot. We've called it classification and evaluation. Classification and appraisal of merchandise, it's the same thing. All of the rules and regulations on C&V, or classification and appraisement, are found in part 152. Something we haven't studied yet, but certainly will in upcoming sections, is in part 159. That's the liquidation of duties, the final assessment of duties by U.S. Customs and Border Protection. That actually comes in towards the end of the entire module on customs clearance into the U.S. And then finally on this slide, part 162, inspection of goods, search of merchandise, and any seizure that has to take place. And it does, when warranted. Running down the list some more, part 163 is record keeping, both in hard copy and or electronic format. 171, any fines, penalties, or forfeitures. 174, on protests. We will study protests when we get down to the part around liquidation. Essentially, a protest being a submission by an importer in disagreement of a ruling provided by Customs and Border Protection. 177 talks about administrative rulings. And in part 191, something we defined and talked a little bit about, duty drawback. Let's wrap up this slide with a trade tip. A part can be further broken down into a subpart, as we see parenthetically, 19 CFR Chapter 1, Part 141, subparts A through H, which is really what we're going to talk about now, and we will see again. As we can note in our title, we're now going to talk about, sure, 19 CFR Chapter 1, but subparts of 19 CFR Part 141. As we should know by now, Part 141 covers the broad topic of entry of merchandise. Because it's so detailed, Part 141 is broken down into 8 subparts, uppercase letter A through H. As we surely understand, each subpart covers a specific topic in much greater detail. Last bullet, in the case of Part 141, the subparts cover 141.1 through 141.13. Let's see what they are. Within this subject of entry of merchandise, Subpart A, which is 141.1 through 141.5, liabilities for duties and requirements to enter merchandise. Subpart B, which is point 11 through point 20, the right to make entry and declarations on entry, a subject that we've talked about and will continue to talk about. Subpart C, powers of attorney. Can't do much without those, especially if we as an importer use a customs broker. All the rules on POAs are found in that Subpart C. And then D, quantity of merchandise to be included in an entry. Rounding out this section, we'll start in our first bullet with Subpart E, which is the presentation of entry papers. Subpart F, really important. We will continue to talk about the subject of invoices, meaning commercial invoices from a vendor overseas and how we use the information on the invoice to prepare our entry. Subpart G, the deposit of estimated duties and how that is done. And then finally, Subpart H, which as we see deals with the release of merchandise. The message here is that the structure of CFR in general, but for our purposes, 19 CFR, is very clear. And it's much better to know how to navigate the various subjects using the chapter, parts, subparts, and table of contents than it is to aspire to know every single thing about U.S. import regs. There's just too much information. We're much better off having a good body of knowledge, but supporting that body of knowledge with a clear understanding of how to use the tools that are made available to us that in the end allow us as an importer to exercise reasonable care and informed compliance. That's it for this section, but when we come back, we'll get into the more visual component of working with ECFR.